think we can begin. So first let me mention what the agenda is of presentations. So today we have Brandon and Greg. On March 30th, we have William, and I think Jimmy also. And on April 6th, we would have Felipe, is that right? So we have at least 3 spaces open, a space on April 6th and 2 spaces on April 13th. And I would like volunteers for those within the next few days. Now, before I ask Brandon to present, what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes summarizing in an outline form, in a schematic form, the agenda of the seminar thus far. And I see the agenda of the seminar, the intellectual agenda, as composed of 7 sets of ideas, and here they are. So first, there was the characterization and criticism of the now dominant style of legal analysis, the principle-based, policy-oriented style of legal analysis, which I call from time to time rationalizing legal analysis. And I presented it as the supposed wave of the future. So it's not just an American tendency, it is a global intellectual event. It is exported from its headquarters, especially in the legal academies of the United States and of Germany, to the whole world, and is presented by its defenders, who are many, as the natural sequel to the supposedly dogmatic, mechanical, deductivist legal thinking of the past meaning the 19th century. And I argued in this first section of the ideas of the course that this style of legal analysis does not deserve to be treated as the wave of the future. Rather than joining this triumphal march, we should opt out and resist it. And I developed then a series of criticisms of the consequences of this style of analysis that would point in a different direction. So that was the first set of ideas of the course, of the seminar. The second set of ideas of the seminar places this contemporary paradigm shift, so to speak, in a larger world historical context. Those are the ideas of what I call the universal history of legal thought. The problems, the intellectual problems presented by this style of legal analysis, this now dominant style, and the cast of legal theories that support it, is a variation on the most universal and ancient pattern of problems in legal thought. There's a conception of legal thought as the explication of an imminent moral order, that's legal thought as doctrine. And then there's the idea of legal thought as the will of the sovereign. And these two fundamental ideas contradict each other in many ways, and moreover, both of them are radically incomplete. And one of the ways in which they are incomplete is that they both depend on a reference to a third hidden element, the idea of the actual structure of society, without which they are meaningless and ineffective. The third set of ideas in the intellectual agenda of the seminar then has to do with social theory, the theory of structure. The explanation of structure and of structural change is the supreme object of ambition in social theory and the overriding object of ambition in politics, which is to maintain the established structure or to change it in some particular direction. And in this part of the arguments of the seminar, we discussed a remarkable fact about our present intellectual predicament, namely that we have no good, no usable theory of structure. There was a classical theory of structure, especially in classical European social theory, and specifically in Marxism. And it is built around a very important and ever important central insight, that the structures, the arrangements of society are made and imagined. They are artifacts. They are not somehow just natural or necessary. But I argue that this central revolutionary insight in the classical theory of structure was circumscribed and eviscerated by a series of fatalistic conceptions, what I call the illusions of false necessity. And rather than simply diluting this classical idea of structure, which is the characteristic way in which these illusions have been dealt with, what we want to do is to get rid of the illusions and radicalize the central revolutionary insight. But that's not what's happened. And that's not what's happened in contemporary social science. I argue that the contemporary social sciences, each in its own way, has suppressed the imperative of structural vision and severed the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. And then I went on to enumerate in outline form some of the characteristics and criteria which an adequate conception of structure would have to fulfill. So those are the first three sets of ideas in the agenda of the seminar. Then the fourth set of ideas has to do with the vocation of legal thought. What are law and legal thought for? And here the crucial point was to distinguish a greater and a lesser vocation of legal thought. The lesser vocation is legal thought in the adjudicative setting, in the setting of the professional interpretation related to judges, courts, professional lawyers. And that lesser vocation has in fact almost entirely absorbed the thinking of the main currents of legal thought and jurisprudence. They've been fixated on this lesser vocation as if it were the only vocation. And I claim that legal thought also has a greater vocation, and the greater vocation is not oriented to legal cases in courts and adjudication, but to the people, to the institutional form of the life of a people and its future. The national conversation about the transformation of the structure. That's the greater vocation of legal thought. The fifth set of ideas in the agenda of the course was then to form a conception and give examples of what would count as a structural program. And I gave a somewhat developed example in the American context. An example of a project of structural change in the United States. Structural change being changed in the institutional arrangements and in the ideological assumptions intimately related to the institutional arrangements. The sixth set of ideas, then, in the agenda of the course was the presentation very early on in the seminar of what I call the toolbox of legal ideas. So my assumption is that the jurists, the experts in law, are not usefully seen as if they were a kind of movement or political party. So it doesn't seem realistic or promising to expect from them collectively a particular program for the transformation of society. As individuals who militate in politics, they may have their own programmatic proposals, but as a group, we can't expect them to be the source of a particular project. Nevertheless, what we might expect them to do is to open the intellectual space of a family of projects, a range of possible endeavors that have this institutional or structural character, which I claim to be deficient in our contemporary days. And I listed some of the elements of that toolbox. Do you remember private law, disaggregated property, and relational contract? Then the experimental form of the administration of the state and its relation to the self-organization of society and to the partnering of the state with enterprises in the private economy. And finally, the ideas that would be crucial to the development of what I call the high-energy democracy. The counterpart to democratizing the market order is deepening democracy. And both those ideas then would have to have institutional content. The seventh set of ideas in the agenda of the seminar has to do then with the problem of agency. Who is going to carry out this effort to use the instruments of legal thought to fulfill the greater vocation as opposed to the lesser vocation? And that's the part of the seminar that we have least explored, and I hope that we will explore more in the remaining weeks. This problem of agency, of the way in which the jurists would connect with the citizenry, with the polity, and serve as advisors to the people, and not simply as whispers into the ears of judges. So that's an outline of the agenda of the seminar. And before I open the floor to today's presentations, I want to go back to the sixth element in this agenda, the toolbox. And in the light of some of the other elements, some of the other parts of the agenda, add two ideas to the toolbox. Now, these ideas are different from the ideas that I mentioned before, because they are what you could call meta ideas. They're higher order ideas. Not about some particular institutional domain, but about the totality of these projects. And I have two ideas in mind. One of them is a programmatic idea with social theoretical presuppositions, and the other is the inverse. It is a social theoretical idea with programmatic implications or consequences. So the first idea I could label the idea of the haven and the store. So behind this now dominant style of legal analysis, the the style of retrospective rationalization of law in the language of impersonal policy and principle. What stands behind that is the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the West. Namely, the social democratic or social liberal settlement of the mid-20th century, which abandoned the attempt fundamentally to reshape the realities of power and of production, and in exchange for that abandonment, established the basis and the instruments of a regulatory and redistributive state that would also be able to manage the economy through counter-cyclical economic policy. And my assumption is that none of the major structural problems of the contemporary societies can be solved or even addressed without reopening the terms of that social democratic and social liberal settlement. We have to go back to doing what at that time was abandoned, namely the attempt to reshape the worlds of production and of politics of power. But we can no longer think of structural change in the way that we used to think about it in classical social theory as simple systemic transformation. Because that leads to the illusion of indivisibility and to what I call the binary idea of politics. Politics is either the reformist management of a system or it is the revolutionary substitution of one system for another. In fact, real structural change, when it happens, is almost invariably piecemeal, gradual, but can nevertheless become revolutionary in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction. Now, the idea of the haven and the store is a transversal idea. It's an idea that cuts across all of the concerns of a would-be substitute for this social democratic or social liberal settlement. Institutionally conservative social democracy, the default position of the contemporary progressives, is almost entirely concerned with what I call the haven. The individual should be protected in a haven of vital safeguards against public and private oppression and of capability assuring endowments. So social democracy is primarily all about this protection. Protection against the forces of insecurity, especially economic insecurity, but insecurity in general. And that is one of the fundamental reasons for its inadequacy. Protection is not enough. what matters most in the last instance is creation, innovation, construction. And construction, in most forms of collective life in the past, has depended on crisis as its enabling condition. Crisis in the two most characteristic forms of economic ruin or military conflict, war. And what we would desire is to diminish this dependence of change on crisis. Now, the storm then is the storm of innovation, of creation, of reinvention, of imagination. And the basic claim that I've made in the programmatic parts of our discussions is that the storm doesn't arise spontaneously or automatically. The storm has to be arranged. And if we secure the individual in a haven of protections, the most important motive that we have to do that is so that that individual can stand up and thrive in the midst of the storm. That's why we secure him. Protection is not an end in itself. Protection is simply an element in a larger ideal of effective agency. And agency requires this ability to stand up in the storm. And the storm is necessary because the storm is what liquefies the otherwise frozen structures of society. So that's one way of characterizing the overarching theme of the family of programmatic or structural alternatives that I consider. What are they about? What is their supreme ambition? It's this dialectic between the haven and the storm. Now that leads to the second meta idea that I want to add to the toolbox. And it's an idea which is in the first instance an idea in social theory. It's an idea about structure. But it is pregnant with programmatic implications. So this is the idea which you could call the idea of the structure revising structure. And it has to do, as a social theoretical conception, with Marx's central insight in the classical theory of structure. The central insight is that the structures of society are not like natural phenomena. They're not just there. They are our creations. And because we created them, we should be able to have of them the intimate knowledge that the Creator has of His creation. And not just a knowledge from the outside, like the knowledge of a natural phenomenon, the atomic structure of a physical object. But the sense in which a structure exists, in which it's just there, in which it has an alien and resistant presence, is variable. A structure that is a set of institutions can be arranged in such a way that it insulates itself against challenge and change, and by doing so acquires a false semblance of naturalness and necessity. Or on the contrary, a structure can be arranged in such a form that it invites its own revision and denudes itself of this mendacious appearance of naturalness and necessity. And this kind of structure, which facilitates its own transformation in the light of experience, is superior. Now, let me suggest the practical interest of this idea. So, first, as I mentioned at a previous moment in our discussions, we have a predicament without historical precedent, which is, like the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century, we have reason to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives over non-structural ones. But unlike those liberals and socialists, we also have reason to resist entrusting our fate to dogmatic structural blueprints. And thus we confront a problem without historical precedent, which is how we can affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. This property that I call structure revising structure, the structures that invite their own revision, is an answer to that problem. Because it says, in effect, we don't commit ourselves to a dogmatic blueprint. We organize in politics and in the economy and in the way in which we educate ourselves an experimental process. And we discover and build the way along the way. Now, further you could say, this has a practical interest for another reason, which is the development of the conception of the state. So in these classical theories of economic prosperity and political freedom, like Mill's theory or Marx's theory, the theoretician proposed a particular institutional direction. And his institutional proposal was offered as a guarantee of both emancipation, freedom, and prosperity, wealth. So here's the way. And the way is the institutional condition for both our moral interest in emancipation and our material interest in the development of the practical productive powers of society. Now, for many different reasons, we find it difficult or impossible to believe in that. That there is some automatic convergence or pre-established harmony between the institutional conditions for the advancement of our material interests and the institutional conditions for the advancement of our moral interests. And we are therefore tempted to adopt an equally dogmatic but opposite dogmatism, which is to fear that there is some tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions for the advancement of our moral interests and the institutional conditions for the advancement of our material interests. But it would be more reasonable to suppose that there is a zone of possible intersection between the institutional conditions of these two sets of interests. In other words, there is a subset of ways of developing the productive powers of society that also advance our moral interest in emancipation, and a subset of the institutional conditions of our moral emancipation, but also advance our material interests. And what do we want, or what should we want, is to identify that zone of intersection and to travel in it. And what is the intuition that would lead us to have this hope, to suppose that there is such an area of intersection? It's the relation of experimentalism to both our material and moral interests. So these structures, like the arrangements of a deepened and developed knowledge economy, or of a high-energy democracy, that promote experimentalism, are structures that should, in principle, facilitate the development of our practical productive powers. Because what do we need to develop our practical productive powers? It's to have our hands untied in the way that we organize a market order, in the way that we combine factors of production, in the way that we relate people to machines and so forth. To have the greatest freedom to experiment. And at the same time, this experimentalism seems to have a powerful relation to our moral interests. Because on what does the overcoming of entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy depend? It depends on our practical ability to challenge their assumptions, to fight about their assumptions, not just intellectually or theoretically, but in political practice. And so that's the intuition that makes us think that in addition to our material interests on one side and our moral interests on the other, there's an intermediate set of interests, which is our interest in experimental freedom, which would serve both these sets of interests and connect them, thus the idea of the zone of intersection. Now we can generalize philosophically as an abstraction the idea implicit in this zone of intersection that I just described. And as I did once in an earlier meeting here at the seminar, we could say there are two classes of activities. There are the routine moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. And then there are the exceptional, the extraordinary moves by which from time to time we challenge and change pieces of this framework of arrangements and assumptions. Now, the relation between these two classes of moves, the ordinary moves and the exceptional moves, is not a constant, but a variable. And we may be able to design practices, institutions, discourses that bring these two sets of moves closer together, so that the activities by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework arise more naturally and continuously from the ordinary business of life, what I call our ordinary moves. And then we would be greater and freer and more powerful. That's another way of stating the central intuition. And it's that intuition which in the end motivates this idea that I call the idea of the structure revising structure. So those are the reasons for which I propose to add to my description of the toolbox, opening up this larger space, those two higher order ideas of the haven and the storm and of the structure revising structure. Now that's what I wanted to say. by way of organizing the agenda of the seminar. And there would be a lot to discuss there if we were to discuss it. But if, before we turn to today's presentations, just let me ask you if there are any general questions about the way in which I've characterized the agenda. I think it's really not reasonable what I'm asking, because these are 7 sets of ideas. Each of them is very complicated. And it's much more complicated to hold them all in your mind at the same time and to relate them to one another. But there's no royal road in thought. This is as clear as I can make it at this level of abstraction. Any comments or questions? Very well. So, Brandon, would you like to present?
Sure. And so I'm hoping to find that intersection here with my project. My project surrounds how civic organizations can potentially play a role in bringing about some of the change that we've been discussing. And so this topic will kind of potentially research some of the different themes, such as trying to identify the agent that could be creating some of the ideas of change. It could also go to how maybe in a piecemeal way we can bring about some change in things like private law and experimentation, and how we can tinker to find ideas. So when I say civic organizations, I'm talking about, it might actually be easier to begin what it isn't. So what I'm not talking about is lobbyist groups or different like almost informational organizations such as the AARP or MAD, Mothers Against Driving. It's not that. Instead, I kind of created 3 buckets of groups. Bucket 1 is purely social groups. The goal of the social groups is somewhat intangible, and it would be largely to just build social capital. And then I'll go into deeper how that plays into the bigger structure. Bucket number 2 are what I'm going to call like shared concern organizations. These could take 2 forms. One, like community problem-solving groups, probably at the local, county, town level, where just good faith citizens are trying to solve local problems. The other bucket would be something that's more thematic. And so it's another section of good faith people who are trying to solve a problem. Environmental, public health, education. Not so specific to become a lobbyist group, but again, another organizational or another group that's trying to solve problems. These are kind of all in this bucket of shared concern. The last bucket I call is the professional task force group, and I'm trying to come up with a better term, but it's basically a multidisciplinary, multi-professional group trying to solve problems. And this could happen more nationally or internationally. The goal with all these groups is it needs to be a cross-section. And that is to say, it's not going to be from any interest group, not from any certain segment of society. These civic organizations only have power if, whether it's a social group, if it's cut across socioeconomic, diversity, gender, professional background, etc. For the professional groups, it can't all be from the same discipline. It only matters if it comes from different segments of society. And I'll go into more why that's important beyond kind of what you can already imagine. The goal, again, is to create different agents and conditions to which change could actually happen. A lot of these groups will come and go if they exist. A lot of civic organizations have come and go. Some have achieved something, some have achieved nothing. But ultimately, this could kind of create potential avenues for change at the local level. It could also create little bubbles and networks that could collaborate and share ideas, whether it be educational ideas, political ideas, economic ideas, and then could export those ideas to already set structures. And so the agents of change within that society are members of that society. So it's not someone coming in trying to do it from afar. It's someone that could potentially export ideas to other established community groups or civic groups, and they can adopt it as it makes sense. But these bubbles could potentially create piecemeal but structural change over time. And my research is theoretical, but also with some historical case studies and a little bit of empirical research that I've come across. And as I kind of go into specifics, I welcome any other historical examples that you could think of that would relate that I can look into. But to give an idea just quickly, the networks of how networks can create bigger change, one of the case studies are the temperance movement, how they actually were mostly temperance societies that became a naturalization that resulted in a constitutional amendment, which resulted in another constitutional amendment. But anyway, but just an idea of like how local organizations can create bubbles of networks to create larger change. So anyway, the three fronts I see these civic organizations working in are on the social, economic, and political. Now, these three fronts, if you will, are all interconnected in some way. Starting with the social is probably the most abstract. There's a lot of kind of theoretical language in social capital. I think some of it can be critiqued, some of it I think is valid, but it's hard to measure. So I've looked at things, everything from like Robert Putnam's research to Nisbet's, to a couple of different 19th century philosophers, and that, you know, I think it's hard to say. This is actually translate to more volunteerism, to more political participation, maybe. But I think regardless, the civic organizations and the social-only organizations, that is like, I know Putnam's famous like Bowling Alone, like bowling leagues, it's not necessarily that, but just more organizations that bring people together. If nothing else, I think it likely creates the conditions where change could occur. Because in a fragmented society, I think that it's impossible to have the high energy politics, or if it's high energy, it's not going to be effective high energy. It's hard to have true economic transformational change if the other is the first and foremost in our mind. So I'll go a little bit into some of the different social capital research as a potential benefit, but I think if nothing else, it creates that base layer, that condition setting for economic and political change to potentially occur. On the political front, trying to create true like grassroots energy, but not in a political movement type way, but in a way that you have a series of organizations that are close to the ground level that are trying to create real change. This will also hopefully result in more civic participation. So voting, I think, is one thing that we've seen some data to support that more voter participation. But really, I'm looking for more participation in the local politics that actually governs a lot of our lives. These community-focused bubbles that will help solve local problems and create alternative power sources to the current one. So right now, we don't have a lot of counterweights. In our two-party system, you have like two big groups and you have some related interest groups, but you don't have a true political counterweight. Having large associations could create other balances of power to influence at the local, state, and to some extent national level. We've seen this through some historical examples. In terms of national politics, for example, we've had some certain like third-party groups that have not necessarily gone on to an office, but have influenced the national dialogue. I'm thinking like the Anti-Mason Party in the 1820s, 1830s, the Greens, the Progressives, the Free Soil Party. These parties had an impact, and they came and went, but they were a different counterweight that created and changed and altered the discourse in national politics. At the local level, these other parties and other centers of power could also have a greater impact than they could be at the national level for certain immediate kind of structural reasons. One of the advantages of having civics groups being a focus of this power is that if the actor is strictly a political group or a local, state, or national government, there's a lot of injunction suits, other things that can kind of stuff this experiment, pretty early. Whereas if it's a genuine civic group that mobilizes enough support to go through a statutory or even amendment process, plus has supportive of a broad swath of the population, is more, the chances of it going farther are great than if you have individual political actors through executive orders, through other means that are not statutory amendment and don't have broad swaths of population. If you only have 40%, you just happen to have a slight majority in Congress, you run into a lot of problems on both on the political and the judiciary jurisprudence side. So anyway, the civic organization focus could actually have that advantage. On the economic side, the also goal is to have another counterweight to industry. Industry also as co-opted by the political organizations, but also as big companies. It's almost reinventing, it's analogous but not the same as the new guilds or trade unions of this century. But I would only present those as other associations that were alternative sources of power in the past. In the relatively early union movement in America, folks like Samuel Gompers did not really want to be co-opted by a political party. He wanted to be an alternative association that could deal directly with employers. He and others felt like the unions actually had more power working as another power source rather than within the two-party system. So in an analogous way, different economically focused groups could be another source of power, but also at the local level, they could be ways of tooling our community for the 21st century. I'm thinking almost like a Big Brothers, Big Sisters type program, but in terms of sharing the skills that you need for the 21st century. And this could be somewhat regional because not every community has certain skills. I'm from part of the country that there's probably not a lot of people that can come teach tech stuff to people, but within the region that could happen. And so, trying to think about different ways that private actors through a community can create this organization that we can help tool people. One thing that I would be hesitant through this model is incorporating the government because a lot of times as money gets attached, say, hey, corporations, you can join, you'll get a tax credit if you just share your sweet knowledge on how to build apps. I think that begins to dilute this alternative power base that it has and also creates more strings attached. So the idea would be that these organizations comprise of multiple individuals from all different backgrounds, but have the goal of retooling the workforce for the 21st century. Again, if you have this, it will lean partially on the work the civic groups do and on the social side, so that that you can have a certain buy-in to society. You have to build social capital, see why in our somewhat individualistic economic model that you have to be a little bit selfless. But that's where social capital would have to come into play. Also with these alternative power bases, I think in our quasi laissez-faire model, an atomized society, the individual is relatively powerless. So if an individual could be part of an organization, that individual could get training, but also a bigger voice in numbers. And so that's the idea there. So how this would actually work are the three different bubbles. Again, the social groups, the the shared concern group. So either a topical specific or like a general community, get stuff done group, and then maybe a professional task force group. So in a professional task force group, that would depend on having.
Could you, Brandon, say a little bit more texturally about these three groups? Mm-hmm. Describe them in a little greater detail.
Sure. So the first one is the social group. This would be more like, say, think about like a Cambridge social activity club that would constantly have programming for all of Cambridge residents that would have something going on all week. You could have, a kids playground park thing going on each evening. You could have more like a Cambridge-wide dodgeball tournament. You could have all kinds of different events. Again, with the goal of simply just trying to get all segments, which Cambridge is diverse in its own way, but it's our own community, and trying to get all folks together. And to certainly.
So in parts of the United States, such groups are often organized on an ethnic basis, like the Greeks, the Armenians, and so forth.
True.
Is it part of your design that they not be organized on such a basis, or what?
I do have some drawbacks, so that goes into my critiques.
Uh-huh.
But yes, I'll jump ahead to that. There is, again, going back to the emphasis on getting a true cross-section of both like sectors in terms of the economic groups, but also of the social groups. One potential pitfall is the potential of actually reinforcing divisions. So for example, between 1870s and 1920 are the highest time in American society that we had these groups, all these fraternal orders, the Elks, all kinds of different groups, Iberians. Largely they were based on immigrant groups, different groups for Protestants, Catholics, Jews, racial groups, etc. So that was a time when we had a lot of these groups, but in terms of building social capital, they weren't particularly effective because they were really organizations to help different groups network, survive at times, integrate into American society, or survive in American society maybe. So that is a pitfall, but the goal would be in each of these groups is to network the community as much as possible. Now naturally there are some communities that based on geography are not particularly diverse, but that is a different sorting problem that I don't think on the first stage of this process it was kind of fixed, but it is important, I think, regardless, that you know your neighbor, because you're not going to be as willing to volunteer most likely if you don't know and then care about your neighbor, if it's someone you just walk by without waving. Some of these other programs might not work. Mm-hmm. So in a large sense, that's the civic group. Again, the shared concern group goes into two buckets. Bucket one is the community action group, the community that, say, Cambridge gets together, good faith citizens, cross section, that is, you have folks that are academics, we have lots of those around here, but you also have like my neighbor across the street who works for the city. He's one of the guys that helps us clear our roads. You might have my other neighbor who works in epidemiology. You have someone from all different areas, and they can come together because that way you can get a broader base of concerns and a broader base of the solution.
Now, when you say shared concern, are they special purpose groups?
So this is the general shared concern group. So this is Cambridge Local Task Force of Fixing Cambridge Problems. Now, you would have this also in Somerville. You would also have this in, where I'm from, in Anderson Township, Ohio. And there's the goal, if you had a lot of these groups, not only would you be fixing community problems, but you'd also be experimenting with different ideas. So say in Cambridge we come up with this really good after-school co-op of sorts that's kind of like a latchkey daycare, but also helps kids with homework. And they say this program works out really well. Then in Anderson Township, Ohio, we also happen to have kids that need after-school care that also has some folks with maybe a little bit extra bandwidth. They could export this model, and that's how you could actually spread it potentially. And it may not work for some communities, it may work for other communities. In parts of California or Florida where it's all retirement communities, maybe they don't need this program. But anyway, this shared community group could be a model of both creating real change at a local level, but also exporting change and experimenting. The other side of this group is the more specialized group, and this one would involve topical change. So I think that you don't want to get too specific. So I would say you would want something like public health. You would not want a group that would be universal healthcare per se, because then you would already start to pigeonhole your ideas. In a shared, say your goal is public health, such a group would need to be, again, diverse in a cross-section. That is to say, not just like doctors and epidemiologists and folks that work in public health, but also probably some environmentalists that understand the environmental impact on people. You might also want individuals who work in like food sourcing and understanding supply chains and how how certain products have
And what
affected
is their role? Their role is to monitor governmental policy or something else?
to create different ideas that could be identify problems and create solutions that could be backed by it. And by having, and also maybe insurance companies too, et cetera. And the goal of having this alternative power base is really threefold. One, this power base could potentially leverage government or even operate independently. So say we identify in the disposable cups, there is actually that film on the inside that is a carcinogen. Maybe independently, rather than waiting for government to tell us that we can't have that film that prevents our cups from dissolving in our hands, industry, doctors working with supply chain people will go ahead and fix it. They identify that before the regulator even gets there. So that's just a problem, just looking at coffee cups on the counter. So anyway, but anyway, this group could be a problem solving group. It could also help work with government and provide suggestions, but also again, the goal of having a cross section is that you could potentially operate without needing government per se. It could potentially be a leader in some of these areas. Or also by getting segments of industry on board. If say the insurance companies have a seat at the table and are able to find something that contribute to the discussion, they're more likely to follow through. They don't have to fight you the whole way through. They can help discuss the problems up front, and then they have more buy-in during implementation. So that's kind of the shared concern group. So again, we have the social groups, the general and more specific shared concern groups, and the last group, what I'm still kind of developing, is the professional task force group. These groups would be broader scale, probably more regional, national, and international. These groups would take, again, I think this group would be a lot more specific in terms of idea generation. They would take professionals, academics, some of the social scientists that we've talked about who have maybe fought some of the institutional change, but maybe if incorporated with different, more professional groups, could create avenues for change. One of the case studies that I've looked at to learn from the past is they'll group how the AFL and the AALL, the American Labor Legislation Group, American Association of Labor Legislation. AALL was a group in the 1910s and 20s, mostly social scientists that wanted to be advocates for labor, but they're largely New York based. They also were out of Madison at one point, but essentially they wanted to help labor through the social sciences. They at times worked with Samuel Gompers and the AFL and others. However, sometimes they worked well together and created real statutory and other changes with industry. Sometimes they clashed because they almost had two different goals and models. So that is one of my case studies to look at what worked and what didn't work with their collaboration. But that would be the idea: is you have professionals and theorists and maybe other practitioners come together, identifying different ideas for maybe even the shared concern groups to implement. But the one reason why I split them off into a third group is that this group could be more national, international, and generate ideas from a wider swath. So the last thing I'll say before I kind of open it up are some of the critiques and drawbacks that I found during my research. One is just talking about how does structural change actually come from this. It's not immediately clear that this model is like a structural change engine. However, I don't think such a thing as we've discussed is ever clear ex ante. It's maybe only clear ex post. So I don't think something that should deter us per se. Also, I do think that creating these organizations gives us the greatest pluralism and opportunity for innovation, and also maybe sets the conditions that these change could be fostered, but also then spread if something is successful. The next thing I would highlight is there is a lot of concern, especially in the more theoretical literature, that these associations could be co-opted, especially for potentially creating almost a totalitarian end. Some of the literature points to how Nazism and to some extent Stalinism also co-opted small groups. They started as maybe at the 10% and then began to build storms. Again, if you have a truly pluralistic society with lots of different associations, I think almost the more Tocqueville sense that the associations become a check on any kind of totalitarian model could be the better way to look at it. But again, it's something to consider given the literature out there. Again, the other concern is how associations could actually reinforce divisions and segregation in society per the 1870s and 1920s example that I mentioned. There were like groups formed in terms of socioeconomic too. So the union leagues also came big during this time, post-bellum, and that was more of a wealthy group. But anyway, they happened in all different segments. But that's something to think about. The hesitation that these groups become strictly lobbyist groups for certain interests, again, is I think always something that will be a concern. And then the final concern is something that some of the literature calls the iron law oligarchy. That is to say, facially it looks like a diverse group, but really it's controlled by a certain number of individuals. It looks democratically involved because there are a lot of participants on paper, but they're not actually that involved, and it's really controlled by a couple individuals, by structures, by laws, opportunities to be involved. Some of that could be mitigated, but that's something also I'm aware of. And so with that, I open up.
So it's interesting because on one interpretation, your thesis is a restatement of the traditional American Tocquevillian theme, right?
A little bit.
That in the United States, life comes from voluntary association. And the people get together and resolve their problems by associating. It seems to me that, and of course, this Tocquevillian idea is one of the main variants of American conservatism, not free market conservatism or moral reaction conservatism, but it's a standard form of the American conservative imagination. I think that where your argument could depart from the traditional Tocquevillian ideas in two respects. That is, to the extent that part of the mission of these groups that you describe is to motivate and propose institutional changes. So they begin small, but then they become big. So they propose little changes that can be the raw material for bigger changes. The second way is this emphasis that you make on the composition of the groups cutting across the established divisions of American society. That's why I asked you about the ethnic basis. So, and I think that's another potentially very powerful idea, that the basis of social cohesion in an advanced democracy is the multiplication of forms of collective action by which people do things together. That is, people who were not related to one another on some antecedent basis become related because they join together in a common purpose, in a common endeavor. And this is a great source of strength then, in which union arises through association, through connection. They're melded together by shared purpose, and that then becomes the source of social cohesion, of social solidarity. So it is true that a disorganized society is a society that is incapable of generating alternatives and of acting on them. So that's how I would interpret the central element of your suggestion.
I think that's.
You know, it's interesting, let me relate this to a less familiar example. We, for example, in Brazil discussed this problem of violent crime. You know, there are two kinds of crime. There is organized crime and disorganized or episodic crime. Disorganized or episodic crime is, in its overall impact on the population, much more important in most settings than organized crime. But these two phenomena have a radically different nature. Organized crime is a phenomenon of the weakness of the state. So organized crime proliferates where the state is absent, and organized crime, in a sense, is a quasi-state. It thrives by providing benefits to people as if it were the state, like the mafia in Italy. Episodic violent crime has a totally different character. It is a phenomenon not of the weakness of the state, but of the disorganization of society. So it's often thought that organized crime is a consequence of inequality, of poverty, and so forth. But if you take two societies that are both poor and unequal, say Brazil in the slums and India, rural India, the level of organized crime in rural India is much, much lower than in the periphery of the Brazilian cities. And the question is why? And the part of the answer seems to be that Indian society at the grassroots is highly organized. Now, not necessarily in a way that we would approve of, because it's organized on the basis of caste and religious organizations, for example. But where there is organization, intense grassroots organization, the level of criminality collapses. Because disorganization goes with lack of transparency, with lack of feelings of responsibility of people for one another, and so forth. And where there is organization, then everyone is seeing everyone else, and in some sense feeling connected and responsible. So it has decisive consequences. So I think that's a very powerful argument. And the question is how this raising of the level of social organization can be given a transformative impulse and related then to an event of institutional change. Yes?
I guess I have a couple of empirical questions. So one would be, like, are you making a claim as to the need for these types of organizations and the extent to which they do or don't exist within society currently? Then the second one is more historical, which is to the extent that they have existed in the past, or to the extent that they have existed in some similar form, have they been, what has been their ability to create social transformation, and more importantly, progressive social transformation. Because, one example that I can think of, which I'm not sure that you listed, is the Know Nothing Party, which, was an alternative third party, but yet was formulated during ethnic hegemony in the United States. And so I guess I'm wondering, and then if I think more recently, many of the groups that you talked about, other than the fact they don't cut across, like if I was to think, the Tea Party might be an example, as might be local militias, like of the types of local organization that I don't think we would like to create a social transformation that they would instill. And then I think I have one final kind of like theoretical question, which is also kind of based on some empirical questions, which is the examples that you showed of whether they're local ethnic organizations were often about creating empowerment for those communities, finding a way for them to be involved in the economic and political life of a particular region. And this is often because of existing forms of exclusion that were happening in those institutions, so there's a need to form an Italian club because there's not those kind of access, or similar. I'm wondering at what level it's achievable to cut across social difference without an opposition to an external threat, right? So like, if I think about like how like Ernest McLeod talks about enchainment, it's often like here's an example of a group that has a particular problem, and they say, oh, it's like your problem over here, we're not exactly alike, but we share a common threat, or there's something we can work on together. In that kind of formulation, it does assume some kind of conflict in society that needs to be addressed. So it's not, it can't be like purely communitarian. Like there is often an enemy that must be addressed through some kind of like popular enchantment. So I'm wondering if you think something like that is necessary to drive the energy to create the type of institutions you're thinking about.
All right, so I'll take the questions in turn. So first, do they exist? I don't think these organizations necessarily exist as I imagine them. Do similar things exist? Yes, there are. I mean, there's a problem-solving caucus in the House, but maybe that isn't a good model because so there are community groups that exist like this in the world, but not necessarily at the scale that I found. So there are pockets of different community groups, but in short, nothing like it. So it would be something that would have to be proposed, advocated, and hopefully work somewhere that it can be pointed to. But in short, they haven't existed. Historically, have they existed? In some examples. So the best example is potentially elements in the progressive era. There were where you had certain groups, a lot of times people with more privileged backgrounds or educated backgrounds or social science backgrounds teaming up with folks that are already working in the cities and parts. Now, mixed record, right? I mean, there were some large statutory changes during the progressive era. You had different experimentations with settlement houses and things like that. You know, some things worked and some things I think we can say they didn't work. You definitely, I think, in my research, and I will admit it's a kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in some of these areas. So if anyone has more background in this, I'm open. It seems like a lot of the social scientists almost kind of, because they had the money and the education, they ultimately kind of strong-armed other ideas. And so that's kind of where I think, where the bylaws of these organizations, they need to have a little bit more board-like structure where, you know, someone is really at first among equals and they can kind of ultimately say, well, that's cute, that's your idea, but I have the money and so this is what we're gonna do. So anyway, I think there are certain issues that, in the progressive era, that's where I saw the faults. And then, as we talked about, I think the greatest fault to any of these groups as I've been looking at it, especially, there are kind of a couple eras. There's an 1870s to 1920s era. Lots of these groups were heavily divided based on the series of different groups that we talked about, and then separately the post-war until like the 1970s. There are a lot of the different associations. Again, not necessarily as cut based on the same specific immigrant groups and stuff, but again, they were based on race, they were based on your class. The fatal flaw, I think, of all of these groups is that there is no emphasis on diversity. In fact, quite the opposite. Kind of going to your third question is they had an other, or they had some kind of what they saw as intrinsic commonality that they kind of formed the nucleus around. So that the goal was not really to build a community with everyone who is here. It's a community to build the community you want to have. And that is, I think, a little antithetical to creating an organization of change if you are creating an organization that you already have right now. And so hopefully that answered your historical question. And then to go back to, I want to make sure I understand the third question. So the third question is, does there almost need to be an other to create this kind of group to actually mobilize? Is that kind of the gist of your?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example. So
okay.
The issues that I worked on, brought primarily Latino residents of a neighborhood not receiving basic services in one part of the country, having talked to a primarily Black community in another part of the country, talking about the fact they were achieving the exact same thing.
Yeah.
In both of those instances, there was a form of exclusion that was happening, economic, political, and otherwise, that they said, here's a common problem that we have against our respective towns, here's our solutions in order to try to achieve it. But there, it was the idea that we could do cross-racial solidarity to address economic issues, but there was an economic issue to address and a constituted power that they were trying to overcome in the form of local governments looking to not spend money on groups they didn't think were worth it. And so in there, there is the idea of we have a common enemy in order to do that. And so when I think of like how to build solidarity, it's often along those lines. We have a common problem, this is the straightforward way to do it. And it's different than the model I heard you proposing in some of them, which were about, very community centric. And it almost seemed like they were solving a problem together rather than solving a problem that they need to overcome against another. And I was wondering if you see a model that escapes this like problem of an inherent social tension.
You're right, and again, this is where we're drinking on Microsoft Word a little bit, right? But I think the goal is that it is community-centric, geographically writ large, not because to try to get over that initial hump. Because if you have your disadvantaged group within this community trying to, you're an alternate power base for sure of sorts. But you've already built in an intrinsic hurdle to get over if you're outside the local government or outside of whatever the institutional power base is. So I think the first goal to try to get over that initial hurdle is to have that cross-section group from the get-go. Because a lot of this is going to have to be messaging, right? If you truly care about your community and you're wasting a third of your human capital, in fact that there are folks that not only are like not doing pretty well from a living standard standpoint, so that's a moral consideration potentially, but like physically your workforce is not contributing to your society, the messaging is you're wasting human capital. So maybe you can try to get some sympathetic bodies to sign on to this board from the institutional power base to form these community groups. And then in terms of sharing ideas across groups, groups can choose to take good ideas from other groups. Some of the ideas, even they might facially look like similar towns. I'm like from the Cincinnati area. A lot of times we look to like Portland and Pittsburgh because they look like similar kind of towns. They both had trolleys. Cincinnati wants trolleys. It didn't work there because they had different things. So sometimes you can have the same type of town, same size town. It doesn't work, and that's okay. Sometimes a lot of things are going to fail. Whole groups are going to fail. And that's kind of the nature of tinkering. But the goal would be to one, I guess, try to get the cross group from the get-go to emulate when it looks like it might work, but then not get discouraged if something doesn't work because that's the nature of experimentation.
Yeah, maybe I'm also contextualizing this too much in reality, but I'm just thinking about this model.
Don't bring reality in here.
This is a great model, and I think you are imagining more of a suburban context where people are fairly permanently or stably located, where they will, at least most of them will be willing to have interaction with their neighbors who are also relatively stable in terms of their geographical location. And I'm thinking about in an urban setting or where people are increasingly more mobilized, where people are more organized maybe online than in real life in a way that you feel more connected to some communities in the cloud and you might not even know your neighbor, in the cities, and where a lot of the people, their jobs are no longer permanently fixed to like a company or something. They are part of the labor force where they would share some of the concerns, but they're freelancers where they, with Zoom and everything. So my question, I guess, is how useful is this model, or how adaptable it is to different contexts, to especially when as an individual, they are not naturally linked to their geographical location. Are they excluded from the project, or would there a way to gauge their interest even if they are a busy New York, let's say big law lawyer who doesn't have much time and probably is living in the city for just like a couple years?
So, I think that there's an idea that in this transient world that the people around you, our relationship with the people around us has fundamentally changed. And I think to some extent we found that it's true. With that being said, as long as we're not fully avatared in a matrix way, we will still interact, we'll still go to a grocery store, we're still gonna walk outside. And so I actually think the community groups could be an engine, even if you're only here for 9 months or a year, to be plugged into a community, to get buy-in where you are now. Because even if you're here just a year, you're still gonna want the sidewalks salted, you're gonna want the streets cleared, you might want some food from the grocery store. And where the community group could come is provide these avenues and opportunities for a while you're here in your community. And your main community may be online, but I think that there's something atomizing about us not knowing the folks physically where we are, and being connected mostly online. 2 backgrounds I have coming into this. This is me personally, Brandon Sharp. I spent 8 years in the military. I lived in 5 different places over the 8 years. Military towns are actually very cold. You have a really warm relationship with your unit, but it's hard to know your neighbors because they're always in and out. And I had to really make an effort to get to know my neighborhood and actually have like a little bit of a group. I would have barbecues, have folks come over, and it's interesting, but that actually forms a community. They also, military towns, there's usually a lot of crime. There's also, they know that you're gone for months at a time, so you need someone to actually watch your place so no one breaks into your house while you're gone for 3 months. But that kind of community takes a little bit of effort, and you know this friend is only going to be here for 6, 12, 18 months, but I still think there's some worth to that, and there's some mutual aid that goes there. On my current street right now, we formed a little block association. We have mostly students, we have professors, retirees, and Section 8 housing corporation, and we formed a little block. And we help each other. When I was home, someone watered my plants. And so these little community groups, we help each other out. We sold our sidewalks, we clear the street because our street doesn't get cleared by the city of Cambridge. These communities, very transient, because I would say about 60% of my street are students, but we know each other and help each other out. And these micro communities, I think have not only can help each other out, but also provide advice, have dinners, and share knowledge and help people out. We've helped people, friends of friends with things through this group. And so that's kind of what I'm picturing. So even if it's transient, I still think there's value. And I think that by surrendering to this idea that the nature of humanity is fundamentally changed, I think might have some atomizing effect.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I guess I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think especially to your social group point, I see the attraction, and I think I'm also might be reading too much into Gen Z's mind because I see them, I'm scared, and a lot of them do live in metaverse now, and you'll never know. Maybe they do think they live, not in the real world anymore, but what I'm thinking about is political change, especially with the current system. It takes so much time. You need organized effort, and for someone who's living there for 6 months, right? It's nice for them to go to a movie party, but then you ask them to put their effort into something that might bring a change in 5 years. So maybe there is something that about this. I'm not saying that it cannot, but I think maybe an interesting point is how this social organization could change the way that the established political institutions react, and maybe can accelerate that reaction or piecemeal it by reacting more localized, so it's faster in a way that would attract more people who even no matter how long you're living there, you would want to be part of that change if you want to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of good ideas. Maybe this is my own institutional thought, but I'm a little bit of a building things over time, but maybe that's my own flaw that I need a community group to come and push back on it. So thank you. No, I'll think a little bit more.
Brandon, I'm a Brazilian from a class society, and I'm tremendously envious hearing all this business about socializing, barbecues with your neighbors and so forth. I guess I think that if I had all of that, I might not think institutional change is so important.
My upstairs neighbor is from Uruguay, and he smokes meat like a champ. Like we just moved from Texas, and he's amazing. So yeah, he was talking about going to Patagonia and putting a sheep on a spigot. I'm like, what, can we do that in Cambridge? So anyway.
Okay, Greg, will you give us your discussion, please?
Yeah, so I'll keep my presentation of my idea relatively short, both because it's relatively underdeveloped and because we don't have much time. So I'll start by connecting my idea with a theme of the class. And one of the things I think we discussed in class was separation of power, and the way in which separation of power has been used in this country to slow down the political process, but alternatively could be used in theory to speed up the political process. One of the most significant elements of separation of power in the United States is judicial review. And what I find really interesting, first of all, on a meta level about separation of powers, is that if you think about democracy in the abstract, if you think about power being derived from the people, then there is only one power because there's only one source of power. So how can you separate power in a democratic society? What does that mean? So when you start to think about what that means, there's conceptually a few ways in which you can separate power. You can create different groups because individual people have like different ideas. How do you combine those ideas together to reach a social consensus? So first you can have like different political groups. So like in the United States, we have states which form, and then we have individuals. So like in the context of the Senate, it's really states which have political power to some extent more than individuals. And then in the context of, say, the election of the presidency, it's through the Electoral College. Let's say, for the purpose of simplicity, that it's the people. And then there's this concept of the court, which is basically just an elite check of some kind. Or one way of interpreting the court is to see it as an elite check on the political branches. Another way of interpreting the court is like as a means of intergenerational control, of like one generation of politicians controlling a future generation of politicians, which is kind of which in a sense is inherently a conservative trait, but has also been used to achieve liberal ends. So I'm interested in exploring the popular roots of separation of power. Where does popular support for separation of power come from? Like, why in America do we support separation of power? In the mind of the American people, what is separation of power? How can you separate power when the power derives from the people? Now, specifically how I want to get at this, I think, is by studying judicial review. There's been a lot published on judicial review, but what I'm thinking is, and there have been a lot of papers on the politics of judicial review, the people who have historically supported judicial review, the people who historically opposed judicial review. But what I want to focus on is either like that when support for judicial review has shifted. So oftentimes that coincided with significant shifts in the court itself. So for instance, famously under FDR, there was the switch in time when the court just kind of switched and started upholding the New Deal instead of tearing it down. And there was kind of a significant shift when the court kind of became liberal in the 60s. in who supports and who opposes judicial review. And you can also see this mimicked early on in the American experiment. But there have already been a lot of papers written on just tracking kind of the politics of judicial review. What I would like to look at is either maybe particular people who, or particular organizations, how organizations shifted in their perspective on judicial review as the court shifted. So for instance, I think the labor movement really did an about face on its support, on its opposition and then support for judicial review in the 1940s. So that's one particular organization I could look at. Like, how did they justify their shift in perspective as an institution and maybe on an individual level? Another thing I might want to look at is any individuals I could find who opposed judicial review when it was against their own political interests. So I think maybe Justice Frankfurter is an example of this. But jurists or politicians or activists who maintained an anti-judicial review position when the values of the court aligned, or the political values of the court aligned with their own political values. And through examining, through several case studies, I really want to come to understand what is judicial review? What is the best interpretation in the public political discourse of judicial review? Is it an intergenerational mechanism of control? Is it an elite check? Is it something else? Is it just completely another expression of political will, just like any other?
And tentatively, what is your conclusion?
I don't know. Most likely, I think tentatively what I would say is that it's I think the intergenerational thing paired with the just another means of political expression thing, like that the court is a means of one Congress and president to impose their views through an alternative mechanism on future institutions, on future iterations of Congress and the president, and that the public imagination on this topic is very politically responsive.
So there's something that confuses me in your presentation, and it's again because I'm not an American. So there's a prior issue to judicial review, which is the issue of constitutional entrenchment. After all, judicial review is an instrument for constitutional invalidation of a law. But prior to the question of judicial review, pro or con, or whatever its merits and demerits, there's the issue of why is there constitutional entrenchment? Then there's a secondary issue of once it exists, how should it be administered? That brings up the case of judicial review. So my understanding of the theory of constitutional entrenchment would be something like this, that in order to expand the scope of democratic politics, we paradoxically have to take something out of the agenda of short-term politics. So these are the basic safeguards, for example, or the rules of that secure the basic endowments of the citizens. The haven that I was talking about, in the haven in the store. So it seems a paradox, but it's an understandable paradox that in order to have a robust political life, something has to be taken out of the agenda of short-term politics, which are these fundamental safeguards, these guarantees, and these endowments that the citizens have. And one of the ways of taking something out of the agenda of short-term politics, for example, would be purely ideological. It would be to have a theory of natural right and to say, these things that we take out are sacrosanct. And so we surround them with an aura of sanctity. Now, sense, it seems that judicial review is a secondary instrument, one of the possible instruments of that. Because after all, there are societies in which, or polities in which there is no divided government, but there is still this practice of trying to take something out of the agenda for short-term politics. Now, so then maybe you might think that judicial review is one technique for reinforcing this idea. So constitutional entrenchment means, for example, you take something out of the agenda of short-term politics, that means that in order to change it, you need some kind of supermajority, like a 2/3 vote or something. So that's an example of making that thing that you took out harder to change. The other example would be giving it this ideological sanctity. Judicial review is then, as it were, doubling the bet, doubling down on that notion that you're taking something out of the agenda in short-term politics. Isn't that it? Isn't it something like that?
So I think the way you just phrased it is kind of like maybe the most idealistic interpretation of judicial review would be like the Supreme Court doesn't matter as a body. This is basically the Constitution speaking for itself. Like the Constitution is.
Yes, there's a theory, of course, that every branch of government, and not just the judiciary, is responsible for the interpretation of the Constitution.
Right, and that's like so. There's several of us here who are taking constitutional law now with Professor Bowie. His argument is basically like, why is the Supreme Court better positioned to interpret the Constitution than Congress or the President or whatever other body? So, yeah, I mean, and you could argue that the Supreme Court is better positioned because it's chosen by Congress specifically based on their qualifications to interpret the Constitution.
Although it's not strictly a constitutional court.
Right, it's not.
Because, after all, there are societies that have constitutional courts, courts that are just constitutional, and they would be even more narrowly equipped and directed to that mission.
Yeah, but I think my topic is somewhat like I'm not so much examining the even like the functional merit of judicial review so much as I'm examining like what it is from a like sociological perspective, because it's like how can power, it goes back to this fundamental question of how can power be divided in a democratic society. And maybe one way of putting it is there's two ways to divide power. You either divide it like geographically, by grouping people in different ways, or you divide it temporally by like how much power does one generation have over another generation. And like the divide between, say, the president versus Congress is kind of more the geographic with the grouping divide versus the divide between maybe the court and the executive and legislative branches is more the temporal divide, maybe something like that. Like it's more like not like functionally what is the theoretical purpose of this, but what is the actual effect it has on society, and what do people see it as? Like what does support or opposition to judicial review derive from? If that makes sense.
Sure. And?
I haven't done enough research yet. I mean, I think the temporal thing will be a big part of my argument, that it derives, that it's largely an exertion of power over future generations. It's inherently a conservative organization, even when it is even like the
But
Brown.
the Constitution itself is that, right?
The Constitution itself is that. It by
I mean,
this definition.
that was Jefferson's idea. Every 2.5 generations, the Constitution should be trashed and
Yes.
replaced, because the dead shouldn't govern the living.
Yeah.
And that idea was rejected in the United States.
Yeah. No, I agree. The Constitution inherently, in that sense, is a conservative system, a conservative document. And
furthermore, and this is why I think there's some intimate connection between this thing I call rationalizing legal analysis and the way Americans look at the Constitution. Because the Constitution is regarded as a definitive document. Every other country in the world changes its constitutions. As I said, in the United States, the traditional way of changing the Constitution is to pretend that it means something different without overtly amending it. And that might be one reason why we want a separate class of people to engage in this abracadabra of pretending it means something different. And this permanent, this sanctity of the Constitution has practical consequences because, as I said, I think in a previous conversation of ours, it's much easier to pretend that equal protection or due process has some different meaning from the meaning that you thought it had 20 years before than to pretend that when the Constitution says there are 3 branches of government, it really means that there are 5 branches of government. That's much harder.
Yeah.
And so the consequence of this idealization of the constitutional document is to shift the direction of constitutional change away from changes in the structure of the state towards changes in the interpretation of substantive rights.
Right.
And that's the predominant character of constitutional change in the United States. That seems to me to be a momentous consequence,
Yeah.
which is in a sense is much more important than anything about judicial review. Judicial review sort of covers that over, or disguises it, or promotes it or something. But it's secondary to this basic operation.
Judicial review also enshrines actual constitutional supremacy into practically speaking, if there were no judicial review, then the Constitution would be an easily amendable document, even if theoretically it wasn't so. But, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to suggest that there's another way to think about, so you mentioned the temporal and the geography. But another way that I actually thought it was the more canonical way of thinking of the judicial system as the democratic or granular. So one of the things that the judicial review allows is Congress passes a law and it's visual abstraction, and then when rubber hits the road, in an individual case, the unfairness emerges. And then judicial review is there to say, look, this is the problem here. But fine, you passed a grand law that maybe look great on paper, but when you apply the law, there's a clear unfairness, and I'm sure the court has to find in the Constitution some source and pretend that the Constitution or protected a right or something. So there's some sense that the judicial review also allows for real on-the-ground conflict to come through an institution, and I don't know if it fits in any.
I think that's an important addition to what I said, because you're right. That's a functional difference in how they function and what they do. That could be another explanation for what separation of power means. I still think that a lot of judicial review as of late has not been it's not like Obama didn't know what he was passing when he passed the ACA, right? And then the court found an application. There was a disagreement about what was and wasn't perhaps constitutional.
Now, something that you haven't said, Greg, but which would occur, I think, quite early on to a critic of judicial review is this. The admirers of judicial review think the most important function, the most important responsibility of the president is to choose people for the Supreme Court. And the critics of this system, like me, would say there's something fundamentally wrong with a democracy in which choosing the members of the Supreme Court is considered the highest responsibility of the president. What's the content of politics? Politics should be about the struggle over the alternatives for the country. It shouldn't be about what the judges are going to do. So I think what that highlights is the extent to which judicial review then becomes an escape valve, a circumvention from the responsibilities of the country for its own future. What are the constitutional judges supposed to do? One of the things they're supposed to do is to help is to save the majority from its own political mistakes. And that seems wrong. That seems, that's a fundamental flaw having to do with the immiseration of democracy.
That's really interesting.
Huh?
Yeah, that makes sense, like channeling the debate in a almost technocratic direction, as opposed to an open conversation of
As if it were, so if you think of this theory of statecraft that animates the practice of judicial review, one way of understanding it is this idea to say, when should the judges cut the Gordian knot? There's an impasse among the political branches. They cut the Gordian knot when it's a bet on the future that the country will support something in the future. The people can't get what they need from the political branches. So the judges intervene in the name of the Constitution and they break the impasse. And then you could, developing the sociology of this or the political science of this, you say, this is most likely to work when these judicial adventurers have as their de facto partners some organized movement in American society, like the social rights movement. Because then there's a de facto partnership between the judicial elite practicing the judicial review and the social movement. If they're acting on their own, without this partnership in civil society, it's much more dangerous, and they're less likely to succeed in their bet on the future. You could develop some such theory, but I think the theory should be disturbing to a defender of the American system or of judicial review, because it suggests there's something wrong with this democracy in which it needs to be saved from itself by this kind of intervention. There's something wrong with that, isn't there?
I agree. I'm skeptical of judicial review. So. Yeah. Judge, agree.
This is probably a little too flippant, but if you watched the confirmation hearings yesterday, it's hard to believe that Congress could itself engage in judicial review, although I agree that was maybe more performative than a joint committee of the judiciaries would be, who have a constitutional responsibility. But it was anything but an intellectual dialogue over the Constitution. I don't know if Professor Bowie would think that that's just politics at that point, but it doesn't
I
happen.
think what Professor Bowie would respond to that is that Ted Cruz, for instance, could have easily been on the Supreme Court. That he told us that these are not different categories of people. These are the same people who chose slightly different career paths. I don't think he sees the Supreme Court as actually any better than Congress at adjudicating these questions.
Perhaps the motivations then from that same individual, when they have two different positions, would be so completely different that they act completely different.
Perhaps. I think it's a good argument, yeah, in defense of judicial review. Yeah.
Any other questions for Greg? Okay, well, thank you very much. And remember, I'm looking for a few more volunteers. So not everyone has presented, and I hope that as many people as possible will.
I've been trying, it's so much concentrating and thing, but on the line, I know. Well, I did just learn that they overlap by only 1 year. Ted Cruz and Judge Brown were each left just 1 year apart in the
So, I'm sure.
They start over, and then they
Would you like to have
Again, I can do it.
Are you for either April 6th? What's your name, what's your name?
Yeah, but ultimately, I think they wouldn't have to actually, because if a political party is trying to see 70% of the country,
There are ways.
is already doing something they want for them. That was smart. And that's why I was trying to say, rather than create a third party, third parties were not really successful. They pushed the needle for one.
NG,
But
okay, very good. So 6 or 13?
Yeah, I'll try to do this.
Okay.
You know.
No, maybe not.
Last week we were talking about
that's why I think we just had a code on
different legal tools
that have money.
that
That's
exist.
the thinking investment. I was gonna say, they're part of their plan is that it's gonna have to do right. They get and that there is a real future if we don't invest in maybe. Again, we waste
And so I
human
was
capital in this country
yeah,
by the millions, right? And so it, you know, do care about the future. I've been reading some, and I'm actually, I want to change my bubble life.
I think in a lot of
You know, it's
You know what I mean?
Yeah, but it's more of the-
standardized.
The Italians. Not so much.